The ruins of Germany in 1945 didn't just whisper, they screamed. Cities were crushed into dust, families torn apart, and each new day was a struggle to stay alive. Into this chaos marched American soldiers. Some saw them as heroes bringing freedom, while others viewed them as occupiers. Most soldiers wanted to finish their mission and go home, but what unfolded between them and Germany's women became a far more complex story, one that stayed buried for decades. When U.S. troops entered Germany, military leaders issued strict orders: no personal contact with German civilians. Washington feared both scandal and sympathy. Commanders didn't want soldiers getting too friendly with the people they had just defeated. But within months, those rules began to crumble. Soldiers and German women started to meet, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of hunger, and often out of pure survival. Germany had been left with a massive social void. Around 7 million men were dead, missing, or held as prisoners of war. Women vastly outnumbered men, many now widows or single mothers trying to feed their children. In that desperate imbalance, survival often depended on small acts of exchange. Cigarettes, not money, became the real currency of post-war Germany. A single American soldier's cigarette ration could buy enough food to feed a family. Coffee, chocolate, and nylon stockings soon followed as the most valuable items. A young soldier fresh from high school could walk into a bombed-out town and suddenly have more power than any local official. Historians still debate what these encounters meant. When a hungry woman accepted food or cigarettes from a soldier, was it her choice or the only option left to her? Many German memoirs recall what they called hunger marriages, relationships built not from love but necessity. American archives, meanwhile, often downplayed these stories, highlighting instead the marriages and friendships that lasted years. In Berlin, countless women turned to American soldiers for protection and food. Compared to the terror inflicted by Soviet troops in the East, the Americans felt like a safer presence. But even there, the same question lingered. Was it love or survival in disguise? By mid-1945, the fraternization ban had nearly collapsed. Commanders realized they couldn't stop soldiers and civilians from mingling. Cigarettes and chocolate had created an entire underground economy. One pack could buy a chicken. A carton could cover rent. The U.S. Army's own reports admitted that American rations had become Germany's unofficial money. Children remembered Hershey's chocolate as a symbol of kindness. Adults remembered it differently. For some, it meant compassion in hard times. For others, it represented a painful trade, the price of food, warmth, or safety. Were these soldiers simply generous young men, or were they part of a system that blurred the line between help and exploitation? Opinions remain divided. Some stories tell of genuine care, even marriages that grew from those first exchanges. Others describe women who felt trapped, unable to refuse without risking hunger or humiliation. Berlin's Tiergarten became infamous as a meeting ground where women sought food or favors from soldiers. Officers often looked away, or even joined the trade themselves. An entire black market ran on American goods. Yet even amid the shadows, real emotion sometimes took root. Some couples stayed together for life, while others faded once rations no longer held power. By autumn 1945, U.S. leaders finally relaxed the no-contact rule. At first, soldiers were allowed to speak only to children, then women, eventually all civilians. Officials called it a policy adjustment, but it was really just accepting what had already happened. In some towns, soldiers joked that the ban ended the moment they saw a smiling face. Chaplains noted that Sunday sermons drew smaller crowds. Many soldiers preferred spending time with local women instead. Rules could be written, but human nature rarely followed them. As the ban lifted, a gray zone emerged. Relationships weren't illegal anymore, but they were judged harshly. German families disapproved. Some American officers worried about reputations back home. Soldiers who fell in love were teased by their peers. Even today, historians disagree on whether ending the ban helped or hurt Germany's recovery. Some say it reduced secret trading and tension. Others believe it allowed a form of dependency that blurred moral lines. In the end, Germany's ruins became the stage for countless human stories, where survival, kindness, and loneliness met in ways history is still trying to understand. The truth of this era sits somewhere in the middle, buried in stories that were rarely spoken out loud. In Frankfurt, investigators discovered entire apartments where German women lived with American soldiers. They cooked, cleaned, and cared for them in exchange for food and safety. Technically, such arrangements were no longer legal, but they blurred the line between companionship and servitude. Military police often ignored them unless they became public scandals. As these relationships grew, word reached Washington. Lawmakers back home grew uneasy. Reports of thousands of marriages between American soldiers and German women filled newspapers, sparking outrage. Some saw it as a sign of reconciliation. Others called it moral decline. In truth, it was neither, it was survival. By the end of 1945, daily life in Germany was measured not by politics, but by calories. Most civilians lived on less than 1,500 calories a day. Bread was scarce, potatoes rationed, and meat nearly gone. For many women, survival meant facing a painful reality. Their only bargaining power was themselves. German archives describe what became known as black market marriages. These were not love stories but survival contracts, exchanges of company or household help for food, cigarettes, or protection. In some towns, children nicknamed American soldiers Uncle Chocolate when they saw them hand out candy. For the kids, it meant hope. For their mothers, it was a complicated trade. Historians still argue about how to view these women. Were they victims of circumstance or survivors using the only means they had left? That question continues to shape how post-war Germany remembers its past. Across cities like Munich and Frankfurt, many women moved into American barracks or shared apartments with soldiers. These makeshift homes erased the line between occupier and occupied. Some soldiers called them war brides, even without marriage vows. For the women, it meant a roof, warmth, and food, but also social judgment. In places like Nuremberg, neighbors accused women of selling themselves to the enemy. Some were shunned, others attacked, punished simply for surviving. One record from Stuttgart tells a mother with 3 children who lived with a U.S. soldier. When asked why, she replied, "Because he feeds my children." That honest answer captures the heart of this time. Survival stripped of pretense. The soldiers themselves were conflicted. Some genuinely cared for the women, sending money home or applying for marriage visas. Others viewed the relationships as temporary comfort. Military leaders tried to regulate it, but human need ignored orders. Behind every gift of chocolate or cigarettes was a silence, the price of dignity, and the question of whether these choices were truly free. As the occupation years continued, darker stories surfaced. Alongside kindness came rumors of misconduct. Between 1945 and 1947, U.S. military courts tried thousands of soldiers for crimes ranging from theft to violence against civilians. Some cases involved women, though few compared to the total number of troops. Each one echoed through already traumatized towns. Many of these trials were hidden from the American press. In 1946, the military even created a special category for private hearings, especially those involving fraternization or abuse. The goal was to protect the image of the liberator. But truth has a way of surfacing. In Kassel, women testified against soldiers who betrayed their trust. When those sentences were later reduced, the German public erupted in anger. Was justice served or reputation protected? Historians still debate it. Not all scandals involved violence. Some were about perception. German newspapers mocked the sight of soldiers walking hand in hand with young German women, while German men still languished in prison camps. Is this liberation? One editorial asked bitterly. For many, it felt like a wound reopened. The U.S. Army itself was divided. Some commanders demanded strict discipline, insisting that misconduct dishonored the American name. Others quietly allowed relationships, claiming it kept peace among troops. Punishment in one city, tolerance in another. It all depended on who was in charge. One whispered story from Heidelberg tells of a colonel who allegedly protected misbehaving soldiers as long as they performed well in the field. Whether true or not, it showed how blurred the truth had become. American soldiers in Germany lived between 2 roles, savior and sinner. They brought food, comfort, and hope, but also left behind scars, some visible, some emotional, and some buried in silence. By 1946, the line between love and necessity had nearly vanished. Thousands of couples could not even define what bound them together: affection, desperation, or both. Between 1945 and 1950, over 20,000 German women married American soldiers and later moved to the United States. Some built lasting families and new lives. Others were abandoned once they arrived, left alone in a foreign country. These marriages had to pass through intense screening. Women were investigated, examined, and judged on their moral character before being granted a visa. Love in those years became paperwork, stamped and approved by military officials. Were these relationships proof that enemies could become family, or evidence of power and survival woven together? Historians still can't agree. But one truth remains clear. In the ruins of post-war Germany, every smile, every ration, every act of kindness carried a shadow that history is still learning to face. How much real choice can exist when one side holds all the food, money, and power? That's the question that still lingers. Were these wartime marriages born from love, or from survival disguised as affection? In shattered Berlin, women often sat with American soldiers in small cafes, sharing coffee and conversation, pretending for a moment that life was normal again. But behind every laugh was a reality that hunger would return the next morning. Many soldiers sensed it too. In letters home, they wondered if the women cared for them or for the rations they carried. And yet, love did exist. Diaries tell of soldiers who protected women from harassment and women who cared for sick or lonely soldiers. These quiet, genuine moments of kindness lived side by side with stories of betrayal and exploitation. Post-war Germany was never simple. It was a landscape painted entirely in shades of gray. One touching story comes from Frankfurt in 1947. A young soldier from Ohio married a German widow. He later wrote, "I loved her because she laughed in a city that had forgotten laughter." They remained married for 50 years. But for every story like theirs, there were many others. Women left behind, children born from vanished fathers, and lives marked by silence and shame. By the late 1940s, the occupation was more than a military mission. It had become a carefully managed narrative. American authorities and German officials worked together to control the story. Propaganda portrayed the U.S. Army as generous heroes rebuilding a broken nation. Posters showed smiling GIs handing out chocolate to children. What the world didn't see were the hidden relationships, the quiet transactions, and the scandals buried deep in court archives. In 1947, the U.S. Information Control Division began censoring German newspapers, banning stories about American misconduct. Editors were told to cut anything that could harm America's image. Instead, they printed cheerful reports of aid deliveries and rebuilding projects. Truth became a controlled commodity, filtered one headline at a time. Was this censorship about maintaining order in a fragile nation, or about protecting reputation at the cost of truth? Historians still debate it. But the result was clear. The American image was polished, while German women's voices were erased. German officials shared the silence. Local leaders feared chaos and relied on U.S. support for food and reconstruction. Speaking out meant risking that aid. So they looked away. Some even silenced women who tried to tell their stories, accusing them of stirring trouble. The cost of that silence was heavy. It buried pain that would not resurface for decades. Official policy even allowed newspapers to publish stories about Soviet crimes while forbidding any mention of American scandals. The outcome was a one-sided history. Soviet portrayed as villains, Americans as saviors. Reality was far more complicated. As the 1950s arrived and Germany slowly rebuilt, the echoes of those early years remained. By 1955, when West Germany regained its sovereignty, more than 90,000 children fathered by American soldiers lived across the country. Some were raised by loving families. Many never knew their fathers. These Army children, as people call them, carried the visible mark of history's silence. Their mothers lived between admiration and condemnation, praised for escaping poverty, yet judged for their choices. Schoolyards became battlegrounds of identity. Was being a GI's child a gift, or a lifelong reminder of survival bargains made when hunger ruled everything. Historians still wrestle with how to define America's legacy in post-war Germany. Was it a time of generosity and rebuilding, or an occupation built on unspoken power? The truth likely lies in both. For every act of kindness, there was an unseen cost. As the Cold War began, America needed to look like a protector, not an oppressor. The darker stories didn't fit that image and were left out of history books. Only decades later, in the 1980s and 1990s, did survivors begin sharing their memories. The smiling images of GIs handing out chocolate endured, but families remembered something deeper.